Hey, fellow Unwatchers, Marc here.
Hi, I'm not Mark, I'm Seth.
In the spirit of the season of giving, don't forget that Unwatchables is on Patreon. We're committed to keeping the podcast both free and ad free, but there are costs involved in its production.
It adds up.
So if you like the podcast, consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1. That's right, $1 a month. And what's in it for you? Well, depending on which tier you select, you can get access to exclusive full-length bonus episodes, including one that's out right now, where Seth and I take a look back at every film we discussed this year, pick our favorites and least favorites, and air out some of our biggest disagreements.
Can I join the Patreon?
No. You can also get the chance to participate in our first ever poll where you decide what we have to watch. So thanks again for everyone making this podcast possible. Keep on watching.
I keep watching, actually, or listening to it. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Unwatchables, the film podcast where to avoid fainting, just keep repeating, it's only a movie, only a movie. I am Marc Dottavio.
I'm Seth Troyer.
And today we're joined by Josh Larsen, film critic and co-host of the long-running podcast Filmspotting, to break down maybe our most literally skin-crawling film yet. Few movies loom larger in the annals of Japanese cyberpunk or stomach-churning body horror than the one we're about to discuss. That gruesome piece of work is Shinya Tsukamoto's 1989 avant-garde cult classic, Tetsuo, the Iron Man. It's not Marvel, but it sure puts the Stark in Tony Stark. But sorry about that, guys.
But is it just a movie?
It's your podcast.
Is it just a movie?
My favorite part is becoming the ridiculous carnival barker at the beginning.
Oh, yeah. He can't help it.
But first things first, I do want to welcome Josh Larsen. You may recognize his voice from Filmspotting, the Chicago-based film podcast that he's co-hosted for over a decade now. Before that, he spent just as long as the film critic for Sun Times Media. And these days, you can read his reviews at larsenonfilm.com or find him at thinkchristian.net, where he is the editor and hosts its Faith and Pop Culture podcast. You can also get his book, Movies Are Prayers, How Films Voice Our Deepest Longings. Josh, thank you so much for joining us for whatever deep longings this particular film is trying to express.
We will see if we can figure that out. Holy cow, man! You're reading the description, and I'm just reminded, even though I've now seen the film, why it took me so long to actually get to it. I knew I would have to someday. Its reputation was too formidable, too great. I just needed an excuse, a push to do that, and yeah, I ended up doing it this past year because I was writing a book on horror and figured I had to take a look at this movie finally. But that description you gave, that's why it's so intimidating, right?
Oh, absolutely. And this is one that's been on our little list for a long time too, as far as ones to tackle. And it was my first time watching it. I think, Seth, you'd seen it before, right?
I'm a big old fan. I like this director. I also love Snake and June and Gemini by him. But yeah, this one, it was super formative for me seeing this around like 17. Just like maximal weirdness, like just going from like watching Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies or something being like the pinnacle of like, wow, that's a wild movie. And now watching that, just like, can't believe the things that can happen on a screen. I can't believe the things that can happen on a screen. I am very curious about your book and how it ties in. So if you could tell us a little bit about it.
For sure. Yeah. So it is going to be on horror, like Movies Are Prayers. It's taking film criticism and doing it from a faith perspective. So the basic idea behind the book, Fear Not, is the tentative title. And if any of this sounds interesting, I've got an email list for people to follow along as it gets towards publication next year. You can sign up at fuller.edu/fearnot. But the idea is basically different subgenres of horror explore different fears. I think most people would agree on that. And so the project I set out was tackling a subgenre per chapter and asking that question, what is the fear explored here? And then bringing that faith lens to it asking, okay, where else do we see that fear explored, expressed in the biblical story? And where might there be an answer in the Bible to that fear that sometimes is actually also echoed in these movies? So one of those subgenres I knew I had to do was body horror. And we can debate, maybe Tetsuo does not necessarily fall into body horror. I think it could fall into a lot of different subgenres. That's where I placed it, just for the literal extreme visuals we get of what happens to the human body in this film. And asked the question when it came to body horror, in the book, I kind of make the argument that it's basically, the fear there is basically of, the fact that our bodies break down, the fact that our bodies don't last, we get sick, we die. Everyone knows that is coming. And that is something that body horror in particular explores. Again, as we get into this movie, we can talk about how it does that, but how it might explore some other fears as well. As you said, Seth, this thing is so wild that you could come at it from many different directions and say, to me, this movie is about this. Maybe there's technology. It's about sexuality. There's an entire thread of, a fear of sexuality we could also touch on in this movie. But generally, as body horror is how I approached it when I watched it for the first time. And yeah, just found a ton of fascinating stuff to dig into on that end.
That's so interesting.
It's especially appropriate too, because I was actually in the middle of I'm just now getting over a very bad bout of flu this weekend, and I was pretty sick when I watched this movie, and I have to say that it added to the experience. That
I imagine
it made it even more excruciating in a way, and painful to watch, because I really was feeling that. In terms of horror, Josh, did you have a particular relationship with that genre before this book? Was this your way of exploring it, or were you already kind of a genre fan?
Yeah, I would say I was a fan. I've been a fan. I'm by no means an expert. I stand somewhere in the middle, where the best way to probably describe this is, of all the keynote horror franchises, I do not necessarily then go through and watch every sequel. I'm not that obsessed with it. But even, since I was a kid really, and was exposed to horror films probably younger than I should have been, became fascinated with this mode of storytelling. And then as I became more serious about film watching, realized fairly early on that horror is one of the best genres to understand the craft of filmmaking, the artistic choices that are being made in terms of music, cinematography, lighting, editing, all of these basics. I think you can see at work often most clearly in the horror genre. They're so integral to how a horror movie functions. And so once I became more serious about studying cinema in that way, that was just such a fertile playground for looking at movies horror movies that way. Maybe I was just trying to distance myself from them, by putting this intellectual lens on it that allowed me to take a step back. But yeah, I'm interested in them as storytelling, but also in terms of the form.
I'm very fascinated and glad to have you on, and having a kind of alternative Christian perspective. Was I was brought up in a Christian household. I am not really of the faith anymore, but looking back, it was a very big thing with horror movies specifically, or anything
Sure.
sexual in cinema was very off limits. And it took me a long time to realize that what actually helped me not be so terrified of things was actually being exposed and sort of exploring these movies that I was afraid to watch after a
Yeah.
certain point. Again, regardless of where I was in my faith, it was actually helpful at a certain point. So yeah, I'm
Yeah,
always
there's
interested in that.
there's a therapeutic, there can be, I should say, for some people, a therapeutic aspect to watching horror films. And I think that does connect with the thesis of the book, which you can get from the title. That's a phrase throughout the Bible. We're told, fear not. And so this is just a deeper exploration of, why are we told that? How does that show up in the biblical story? And then how do certain horror movies, not all horror movies, but certain horror movies function in this same way, where we can confront fears we have, work our way through them, deal with them in a space that is troubling, certainly when we're watching a movie, but also safe, because it is at the same time only a movie. So just as you can have that process from a secular experience. Absolutely. What I'm trying to do in the book is look at it along a faith parallel as well.
Yeah, that's a great introduction, I think, into this particular topic. I do want to provide a little bit of background, just specifically on this genre, because that was something that I really just started learning about in preparation for this, which is Japanese cyberpunk. You mentioned that some people might even argue that this isn't a horror film, which, I mean, to me, this is a distinction without a difference, because it was a horrific experience
Yeah, I
watching
mean,
it. We see all kinds of horrible things.
it's a lot of things.
Yeah, for sure. But as far as historically, cyberpunk on the American end is, we kind of think about, the high tech dystopias and films like Blade Runner, Philip K. Dick
Neur-
novels, William
Neuromancer,
Gibson,
yeah,
Neuromancer.
which came out
And
like I think 5 years before this, 84. So
yeah, that sounds right.
mhm.
And I think the Japanese strain is maybe a little more extreme stylistically. It's more abstract in its storytelling, and that might be because the origins are a little less literary. As opposed to in America, this was kind of more based in like the underground punk music scene, and I think you can see that in the energy and the experimentation in the filmmaking itself. And of course, appropriately for this movie is the focus on the bodily transformation, which I think makes sense because in this time period in the 1980s, Japan was kind of rapidly industrializing in their economy, after, coming out of the war and kind of becoming a superpower again. And I think you can see the anxieties about that in movies like this from people who are feeling that they were kind of being subsumed by technology, and maybe just kind of the sense that there was a bubble that was about to burst, and which it did in some point in the 90s. And and obviously they were living in the shadow of an actual kind of apocalyptic event with the nuclear bombs. So I think all that context, it really adds to this, but also you can really see that in the undercurrent.
Yeah, as a cyberpunk movie, and I'm glad you make that distinction because there are always like subgenres to the subgenres, right? You can continue to drill down until you get to the most specific type of movie this might be, any movie might be. And so you're probably right to classify it that way. I think in terms of the technology, which cyberpunk is obviously intimately concerned with, this is a movie that almost at the same time looks backward and looks forward. So you can imagine this not being made. The tools weren't there. Um, and if cinema was even there in the very early days of industrialization itself on any level, when machines were becoming a daily part of people's lives and particularly their jobs, how they do their work. I think it's interesting that the main character here is described as a salary man, right? He's not necessarily involved in machine work, but he's identified as a worker. That's how we come to know him. And so in this sense, Tetsuo looks back to the early days of industrialization and asking, what is this going to do to us as humans now that machinery has become such an integral part of our lives? Then it's looking forward, and it wouldn't have any idea really how to know this. We don't get any sense of something like the iPhone or the iPad or AirPods or these things that increasingly, I mean, just follow that transition from the iPhone, which we hold in our hand, to the AirPods, which we put in our ears. We're already like another step towards what we see in Tetsuo, where the actual technology is embedded in our skin. And so here is where the movie looks forward, even though it's if you're talking about it being made in 1989, it's well before the invention of these other technological devices we now live with. I think that uncertainty it expresses about how intimate technology has been and could possibly get to with us physically, with our actual bodies. That's where the movie is prescient in a lot of ways. So it's exploring the same tension in two different directions.
Yeah, and the key word is tension, which I love about it. It's not just as simple as being like anti-progress or against technology moving forward. It's not that machines are bad. It's clearly like, I mean, there's a character called the mechanical fetishist or something, and there is like clearly like an excitement about machines, and there is like this artist is clearly like obsessed and fascinated by machinery and wires and everything like that. But it's also like obviously showing you something both beautiful and grotesque, which it is like always like these things move us forward, but they also are like moving us backwards at the same time. It feels, I like that tension in the movie.
Yeah, what do you
Yeah,
guys
there's a
make?
no. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, what do you guys make of this character, the metal fetishist? You know, played by Shinya Tsukamoto, the director, the special effects specialist behind all of these amazing images and terrifying images we see. Also wrote the movie, also edited it. This character that he plays as well. I like the point you're making there, Seth, that he is at once sort of like this pranksterish demon we should fear, but also is this incredibly inventive force, sometimes presented as a force for liberation almost. So maybe it goes back to the idea of tension. We're not meant to have any one single idea of this figure, but I'm curious to hear what your experience, especially you, Mark, having watched it the first time as I did. Like, what were you making of this character as this thing was going on?
Yeah, there's a real ambivalence because the first thing that struck out to me is that there are these photos of what look like runners, maybe Olympic runners or something, that are posted all over his, all these wires and machinery, which immediately puts you into mind about this being like achieving some kind of a peak physical form. And I almost see that in the sense of this being like a really twisted superhero movie, which is kind of what it becomes to me in the latter half, because we do have these two characters. Really, it's more there are like two Iron Men in this, which I also was not expecting. And at one point, it does seem to become like a kind of a battle between this grotesque superhero and supervillain, and they are. There's a side that where it's like they're battling each other, but also they seem to kind of come together in the end, like they're going to take over the world. So you have that side, but also this transformation that he goes through is not incredibly empowering in the sense that it's painful, it's horrific, and those things coexist side by side in this. And I guess I come away with it probably with the strongest impression being one that is of terror and anxiety about it. But it does give you enough, I think, to kind of see the nuances between there of where it could be going. And I think you see that in a lot of things like, this is a live action film, but a lot of Japanese cyberpunk is in manga or in works like Akira and Ghost in the Shell and those kind of movies that would eventually go on to influence more modern kind of cyberpunk inspired works like The Matrix. So on one hand, we have this kind of liberating futurism, and on the other side, it is like we're losing control of our own autonomy, our own bodies, and I think it really taps into the terror part of that.
I love the fetishist. I think that character is so, like you said, like he's pranksterish. He's like those wild eyes, and I mean it. He really speaks to another aspect that is clearly an obsession for this director, which is movement. Like his signature thing beyond just like these wild, like grotesque creatures that he creates are these like stop motion, like super fast movement scenes where like the character is like through stop motion is like barreling down the street or in like going looking like they're going as fast as a car, like, and stuff like that. It's like a great effect, and he seems to be really obsessed with like speed and momentum. So that's what the like all the little like pictures of runners and everything like that really point to me as being like yet another like obsession that this director is like that's oozing out of him.
Yeah, can you tell me a little bit more about his other films that you've seen, Seth? Because I'd be curious to hear if there are figures similar to this. It sounds like there are techniques similarly used in some of his other movies, but is this, from what you've seen, a completely original vision, or does it fit pretty squarely with some of his other work?
Um, I know he has a lot of movies that I haven't seen. I haven't seen one that really used that like stop motion kind of thing as much as this. But his obsessions with like sex and like the grotesqueries of sex are like definitely present in something like Snake and June. And Gemini is like full of there's like this guy who's turning into a creature. It's yet another like more, I think it's set in like feudal Japan or something like that, but it's similar to Tetsuo in the way that it is like someone going through this transformation that is both psychological and physical.
Yeah, that makes sense, because the other way I describe Tetsuo in the book is as psychosomatic horror. You know, there's a sense where um, that none of this might really be happening. These might just be the extreme stress dreams of this salary man, right? And
Right.
in that sense, it's, you know, it's body horror that we're imagining, and maybe in some way like actually forcing to happen to our bodies by our fears and imagining of it, like we're actually willing it into existence, or at least this character is in some way. But yeah, I think it's interesting to think about Tetsuo in this sense as well, in that sort of category.
Yeah. And I mean, even just tracking the plot, which is difficult sometimes, like just figuring out, like, because we jump a lot in like sort of unorthodox ways, and characters turn into other characters. I believe, like, I think I understand it correctly that, like, one of the instigating, like, things is when he's on, like, he's waiting for a subway and a woman, like, pokes this ball that has a little guy inside of it. It's very confusing and
It's like
strange,
a
but
lump of robot flesh or something.
it causes her to turn into like one of the Iron Men people and chases the businessman around, and eventually she like becomes the metal fetishist at a certain point. Am I correct? Like she turns into him.
It's entirely possible. This is one where I had to immediately, after watching it, go and Google plot synopsis to even get my bearings, because I had some sense of what I thought was happening. But honestly, plot wise, and this speaks to what you were saying, Mark, I think about maybe, you know, this subgenre not being rooted in established narratives. Maybe that's part of it. You know, plot wise, I was pretty lost. I had a sense of the ideas at play and the themes and could appreciate the inventive visuals. But in terms of this is how we got from here to here and why, and even timeline chronology, it was pretty difficult to track on a first viewing. And you could even, you know, the woman in the subway station, you could try to name that in terms of linearity, like this leads to this and this leads to this. But for me, she might also be connected to this idea of a fear of sex that is at play in the
Mm-hmm.
movie. You know, this is maybe one of the early evidences that there is on the part of the salaryman some sort of fear of women or guilt about sex. Something like that could also be at play in that incredible sequence in the subway.
Yeah, I was definitely thrown off by that particular sequence because it doesn't seem to necessarily play into this linear narrative, you know, which is him going through this transformation. Now all of a sudden he's, you know, running into someone in the subway, and but I like the angle of seeing how that goes into the way this movie approaches desire and sex, which is also I think a big part of the Japanese strain of cyberpunk. That this is full of stuff like this fantasy where his girlfriend or some kind of woman is basically sodomizing him with this kind of like robotic phallus, and of course at one point he does emerge himself with this drill genitalia, which is probably one of the most memorable images of the movie. And it's hard to think of a stronger image of that kind of anxiety than what we get from that. And this movie really is tapping into this sense of perversion and repression that is being refracted through this future terror.
Yeah, she's chased around by the drill penis, and then eventually just like gives in and like sits on it with like an evil grin, and like blood goes everywhere and she dies, and then she's in the bathtub and like flowers are coming out of her. It's just so visually wild, and he like pours out of his cord like oil into her mouth, which is of course like yeah, another sexual thing that you can easily read into this. It's wild.
And it's
I
all
mean,
rooted as well. Like all of that insanity is also rooted in a fairly chaste, at least for this movie, the moment, the flashback where we see him and the girlfriend in the woods,
Yes.
and they start, you know, against a tree. They're making out, eventually having, and it seems like this, what's happening later is almost, I don't know if it's an expression, his vision, his dreams of guilt over that. Because if I'm remembering correctly, to tie it back to the metal fetishists, that is happening after they've hit him. When he ran out into the street, they hit him with a car,
At the
and then they
beginning,
take his
yeah.
body and hide it in the forest. Because I believe there's a shot of them having sex against the tree from the perspective of the metal fetishist. And so here we're kind of, you know, it's all again becoming this psychological, a work of psychological horror. Is It's almost like having sex after committing that act. Everything gets intermingled in the mind of the salaryman. The guilt gets intermingled with the sex act, and all of that just explodes in this later bizarre and horrific sequence that you were just describing, Seth.
Yeah, they've crossed like over a threshold, and now they're in like this new world after that like crazy like sin that they've committed, right? And I love that sequence because it's filmed, like the way it looks, like the film is super grainy, almost it looks like a shitty like handheld or like a security camera, like almost like it's a security camera, or like feels like some kind of snuff looking film or something, which a lot of the movie kind of has that feeling like you found this object or something.
Mm.
It's a lot. It's very interesting. There's like static going on, which that points to like other moments in it too, where there's these like uh a ball of wires will open up, and there's like another like character in this. There's like a TV that's in the ball of wires, and every once in a while we return to it where there's like this scientist guy or somebody. He's like old, and he's saying like cryptic things. Um, Not sure what that was all about. A lot of the dialogue is so cryptic. I love it.
that's funny too because I read that when this played at the 1989 Fanta Festival in Rome, where it won Best Film, and it was such a kind of low budget success story that it played without even having any subtitles at that particular screening because he couldn't afford to do them. And that kind of goes back to the production of this film, which was done over 18 months and by all accounts was extremely grueling, and they lost most of the crew by the time it got to the end, and the actors were helping to light scenes and the conditions were not very good. And while the director was still working his day job. And I think that's one of the things that ties this to a underground movie like Eraserhead. It has a lot of superficial similarities to it, but it was also kind
Mm.
of filmed in the same way over a long stretch of time in creating its own world, and kind of felt like it came out of nowhere to audiences because it was from someone who was unknown, who was just working on this insane passion project. And I'm interested to talk about the influence that you see, with David Lynch, with David Cronenberg, name any other David, I guess you want to throw in there. And Josh, did you have any thoughts about how this ties in with those filmmakers?
Yeah, I mean, in the body horror chapter, I spent a lot of time on Cronenberg, of course, but it's Lynch and it's Eraserhead specifically that I talk about in tandem with Tetsuo the Iron Man. And oh, let me back up there. Just knocked him out as I knew I would. Uh, but it's Lynch and Eraserhead specifically that I connect to Tetsuo the Iron Man. And I think it's under that idea I was talking about before of psychosomatic body horror, where we kind of, we worry about something so much we make it happen, come out as an actual physical ailment. And when you think about Eraserhead as really a movie about a new father's fear of being a new father. I mean, it could be read as a nightmare about the prospect of having kids, right?
Mhm.
Eraserhead, you've got this mewling baby newborn that doesn't even look like a baby. It looks like a worm that he's trapped in this apartment with and doesn't know what to do with it. That's one reading of what Eraserhead could be all about, is what in that case, our bodies can create, and how we don't have control of that either, even though we are given the responsibility of having control of it. I mean, there's just a lot of parental stuff going on in Eraserhead, but I do see it as a vision in the way that I do see Tetsuo also as a vision. Call it a dream, call it a premonition, something where there is a psychological underpinning that is causing all of this to burst forth in the characters' heads, and then perhaps, if it gains enough power, out into the actual world. And then we can debate, where that line is crossed. I think in Eraserhead, of the moment where he dreams or imagines the father, dreams or imagines the baby, his head basically pops off. Jack Nance's head pops off, and it's replaced by that mewling baby worm head, and so that how many different, it's almost as layered in the psychological implications, that moment, as what we were talking about in the, I guess you call it a sex scene in Tetsuo, the sex/death scene in Tetsuo. There are so many different layers going on there. So yeah, that's interesting that you connect those two, because I saw the same thing going on and actually write about it in the book that way.
And to connect it to another one that I would definitely recommend for what's going on with your book too is a movie called Begotten, which we talked about on this podcast,
Oh
which is
Lord.
like
Okay.
maybe like a movie that I could definitely compare to this, being this, like, it is like a vision, like nightmare, and it's all like this scratchy black and white, similarly like that could be like this strange trilogy in my mind of like Eraserhead, Tetsuo, and Begotten. Begotten also has this, like, it's more of like it's like this creation myth sort of thing, like God is like God kills himself at the beginning, of course, and gives birth to this strange creature who goes through all this pain, but also there's like these sexual elements. I found it really weird that movie came out the same year as this movie. I don't think they were like in dialogue, but I don't know, maybe in some weird psychosphere they were.
Yeah, that does have a whole religious like undercurrent to it too. I didn't think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Good, that's a good one, Seth. I think what separates this though from Lynch and from Cronenberg though is the actual style and how manic and stylized it is. And I think that was the thing that I was least prepared for. So I went in knowing like, all right, I'm going to see some gross stuff, and we get some real gross stuff right up front with the guy who is the fetishist who is like cutting his leg open and shoving a metal rod in, and we get this close up of maggots coming out of it, and I'm already like, ugh. But then all this other stuff starts happening: the sped up footage, the quick cutting, this title sequence that's almost like a music video, like Freak Out, and these subliminal cutaways that don't always make sense. Like there's something that has like a baby or a small child's laugh that we keep hearing,
Oh God, I
and
hate that.
which is very unnerving. All the more so, yeah, all the more so for not having a really like logical, rational place in the film. And that kind of stuff, I think, it comes out of the cyberpunk ethos, but also it just makes it so much about texture, about the metallic imagery, the sound of metal scraping, and the industrial score in this movie that just goes
Yes.
so hard. I love
It's
the music.
beautiful.
Yeah. Well, beautiful is one word. I gotta say, this is that is the element that disturbed me the most, which was a surprise. I didn't expect that coming in. The score by Chu Ishikawa. It's, I knew the images would be bad, as you were saying, Mark. And maybe it's a thing where when you expect that, you almost start to, though I don't know if this ever happened with this movie, but you start to become accustomed to it. I don't know that I ever got accustomed to what I saw in Tetsuo. I know I never got accustomed to that score, as relentless as it was. And I think it serves the film. This is not a complaint at all. It serves the film absolutely perfectly. But you talked about the metallic scraping, the screaming that we hear in the background, the clanging that goes on. I've described it before as like, you mentioned the moment early on where that rod, he inserts the rod into his thigh. It's almost like there was a traditional, not traditional, but like a more standard score of some sort. And then to make it fit for this film, it's like Ishikawa just shoved a rod in between the notes and messed them up, or into the
Mhm.
instruments. It was just like actually putting metal into what was making the music to get something of what we hear here, which is honestly the most viscerally disturbing element of the film for me.
Yeah, the focus on sound and movement, and maybe it's like an obvious thing, but there are these movies that I really love that could only be movies, or like there's like comics that I love that could, like, it only could work as a comic book, and this like is one of those that's like, this is for this specific visual medium because it's all about these things working together. Like, as much as I say that it's like a living anime or manga or something, it's like it had to be this, where it's about like the way things are moving, flashing on screen, and the way like the textured sound works in your ears all at once. I love that about it.
Well, and that goes back to what you were saying, Mark, about an early screening not having the subtitles yet. And this is a movie that really doesn't need them in a lot of ways. I,
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think, even one line of dialogue that I do remember, at some point, he says, the salaryman says, "I'm being punished. That must be it." And even that feels, a bit like, yeah, it was pretty clear that was at play. Like this is in some form, this could be seen as a punishment for his sin of hitting the fetishist and then trying to dump the body. That's one reading. So it didn't even need to be said to us out loud. It's one of multiple other readings. There could be other things at play as well. But really, the film didn't even need that for it to really communicate that as a possibility, because of all the oppressive but incisive aesthetic choices that have been made.
I agree that, and I think we're all kind of on the same page that this is first and foremost a visceral aesthetic experience, and the strong point really isn't in like a plot, or even though it does try to throw some of that stuff in, it does kind of reveal that he and his girlfriend were in the car that ran over the fetishist early on, and there does seem to be some things like that inserted in there, but I think it's stronger when you're able to just let go of that stuff. And for a movie that is chiefly working on that level, I am interested to hear what you guys just think about the length. So this is only an hour and 6 minutes long. Did it feel like a quick ride to you, or is there something where something this extreme, does it start to outstay its welcome a little, even at that short of a length?
I think for me, it's a matter of individual sequences possibly outstaying their welcome more than the entire film. And the one we were describing, the sex/death scene,
Mhm.
I think that's a case where, once I understand the thematic psychological ideas at play, and I've gotten a sense of the extreme aesthetic creations that have been devised to communicate that, then after a while, I can start to be like, it does start to feel punishing in an unenlightening way, if that makes sense, because I'm not necessarily someone who's ever been attracted to horror purely because of the gore. Or you'll see some people respond to horror movies and talk about, the kills, the quality of the kills, that sort of thing. That's just never been, the way I've sort of approached the genre. And I don't think anything like that necessarily happens here, but you can get some sequences, and that's the one that just comes to mind, maybe because we were describing it,
Mhm.
where it gets to be a little bit like, okay, I get it. This is really becoming punishing, even though it is also, and this is where Tetsuo is such a remarkable film. It does, though, still continue to one up itself in terms of creativity in how it's going to be punishing. So it's hard to say you'd want more of any of this.
Hmm.
I think there are maybe individual sequences where I might say, I get it, I could use a little bit less.
Yeah, yeah. It never. You're right. It never loses steam at all, for sure.
No.
It's always moving, but I do think it's like individual scenes do feel like I don't know, like fucking long prog songs that just all right. We don't need another synthesizer solo here, kind of thing. But I mean, if
We don't
anything,
need another
my
penis drill here. One penis drill was
no,
enough.
I know. Well,
He'd
but
never
I
have
think
enough.
there's definitely also just in the sheer unorthodox nature of how the plot is distributed to you, you're so placeless on like even if it is an hour and you know it's an hour, and even if you're doing the 2022 thing and you're checking like, all right, I'm like halfway through, it's hard to figure out like what the arc is here and like because it's not a traditional story. So if anything, that could be like what's more difficult even than some of the imagery. I think here sometimes is the placelessness of the narrative.
I like that word, placelessness. And I think that's to its credit. I think that's a good
Sure.
quality of this film, right? It keeps you adrift. Because as we've suggested, there is care. The narrative is not a strong point, but it's not an afterthought either. It's
Mhm.
structured as suspense. I think you said, Mark, how there is the reveal of that the salaryman and his girlfriend are guilty of this. It's not something that we're told right up front. And I don't think that's, out of incoherence of any sort. I think that is because there is some element of suspense being built into this. So care was given to give it a certain amount of narrative structure, but overall it has that placelessness, as you say, Seth, that I think that really works in its favor in terms of disorienting us as well.
Yeah, even the dialogue is like broken. Like even when there's no like traditional dialogue scenes where like, all right, these are the normal people talking. Like at the very beginning, like one of the first exchanges is just like a guy on his phone and he's talking to a woman and it's just they just say hello back and forth. It's like we could talk about very Lynchian. Like they just back and forth with different intonations saying hello, 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 hello. And it's just like no aspect of this gives you a foothold, really. It's interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, you never get a chance to get your bearings. There's no like baseline really, and I guess you compare it to Eraserhead in that way, where it is creating its own world, like I guess kind of a dystopia that's not very finely defined here, but you get little glimpses of how everything kind of looks like a metal junkyard. But then at the same time, there is like a train station that looks relatively normal. So it's kind of hard to exactly place everything. And part of that might be due to the resources they had available and the way that the film was made, in addition to just the intentionality of all of that.
They definitely share, in terms of setting, it goes back to the idea of industrialization. You get a
Mhm.
sense, absolutely in Eraserhead, like this guy seems to live in some sort of abandoned factory town, if not in the middle of an abandoned factory. And there are more elements of a functioning society in Tetsuo, as you say, Mark, with the subway, but still the majority of the action does seem to take place in just a series of abandoned factories or office spaces or just storage supply closets
Mhm.
where
Yeah.
there is all of this material piled up, metallic material, industrial material piled up. That's mostly what this world seems to consist of. Aside from, as we said, though, another exception that proves the rule would be that forest again, which it's also nightmarish, but compared to the other settings, idyllic in a way that is interesting.
And
Yeah.
especially because it's the only glimpse of like the natural world that we get here, which is
Right.
definitely, opposed to all the other things that we're dealing with, all of the themes and imagery that are encroaching and taking over, his very body. So, yeah, nature doesn't have, it's pretty bleak as far as the prospects of nature go in this movie.
Sure,
Um,
and I do love how narrow its map is as to like settings, which is a symptom of low budget filmmaking. But it really works for the claustrophobic kind of feeling. Like they spend so much time in that apartment, which I guess was owned by uh, the girl who fucks him with the cord, like the weird wire at a certain point, who he chases around with the drill penis. And they did like when they like put holes in her door, they did just like destroy that apartment, I guess. So no security deposit was gained. Uh, including with him isolating all of his friends.
Yeah, that's what friends are for.
I guess so.
Oh gosh, but yeah, and this, I do feel that there is kind of a divide in the two halves of this movie. That there's a point where it turns from something that is a very insinuating and insidious, kind of focus on the body horror and the psychological and subjective aspect of things, to when he starts kind of battling with with the fetishist, and it does start to become this strange. Maybe only nowadays it really looks like a superhero movie to me. I mean, it's a
It's like
perversion of it for sure, but just the way that they both have kind of powers and are fighting with each other and running around. And I think that's probably where maybe the length uh, started to wear a little thin for me, or maybe it's just that I preferred the first kind of mode to the second, which gets I don't know, maybe a little sillier than the early part. But I don't know. Did anybody else see a kind of a split there,
There's
or process that
definitely
differently?
there's definitely a shift, and I think the way you describe it is accurate. I almost think of, and maybe this is, I'm going way back to my childhood now, so maybe this isn't really an accurate comparison, but I think it was called Voltron, like this
I
animated.
watched that.
Okay, and I'm not sure if that
Mm.
was from Japan, possibly Korea. I'm not sure by the time it got to us in the States, but that latter half, this latter section you're talking about, Mark, has the sort of giant robots fighting each other sense. And I think Voltron must have been early 80s, so something like that was in the
Mm.
air that is sort of superhero-y, but also maybe, of a different sort of, from a different source when you're talking about Asian cinema. And that's maybe one of the entry points that I had as a little kid. But it did remind me of that. I think, interestingly, what's interesting about it is how it shifts what we think of the salaryman and what's becoming of him. And it goes back to this idea that I was talking about. Is there any sense of liberation in this? Like, is
Mhm.
he finding um, his true purpose in any way? Has he escaped? Like, if this relationship, if sexuality, if women essentially were so distressing to him, if that's one reading of the relationship with his girlfriend, who I don't know if we've mentioned yet, but played by Kei Fujiwara, if that's so distressing to him, is this some sort of liberation to become essentially this metal man who is now, far removed from such icky human physical requirements as sex? I don't know. I'm just wondering how that whole last section might register again, even though it's kind of battling robots, psychologically still. Like, what does this mean for the salaryman? Because you're right, as one of you said, he teams up with the metal fetishist. They essentially become one and then go out into the wider world in a sense to take it over. And it's this further expression of technology taking over. I guess I'm wondering, even emotionally or psychologically, how that made each of you feel. If that felt like a curse to the salaryman, if it felt like liberation in
Mhm.
some way, or something else.
Well, I mean, I can't help but see like, and maybe it's because I'm a artist myself, but just see this as like similar again to Eraserhead or something. It being more of like he is channeling more of like a free association sort of thing. I don't know that he has like a totally like grand thesis for like something like the ending. Again, I just see it as like a stream of obsessions. So
Sure.
what comes to mind for me is definitely like in the Japanese like vernacular like of cinema is like the kaiju battle, like Godzilla and all that, and like Gundams, and yeah, you said Voltron. So it's like it's all kind of like almost boiling down. And Mark did say that it's like silly at that point. It almost feels like it is like at that point, like almost on purpose. It's like wrestlers after all this like um,
Mhm.
sort of adult stuff almost at the beginning. Like it's almost like they've divorced themselves so far from the world that now it's just these like base level masculine. Like there's no more like feminine aspect to it. Now it is
Interesting.
just like battle, battle, battle.
Playtime, boys
going
playing.
on playtime, and also like maybe a gay thing. They merge, they become one thing, and just want to fucking destroy the world now. Like it would just like, which, you know, I don't know what kind of like metaphor to read into that other than it's just that's what they're doing. They're going to go destroy the world and turn the world into metal and then rust that.
Yeah. It's very
Turn into something that
nihilistic
they
in a way,
love
right?
and worship, and then destroy that too.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of, of nihilism taking over. You could absolutely read it that way in their trajectory at the end of the film.
Yeah, and what I did find really interesting is, and I wrote this down because I don't know, in the subtitles of the version I watched on the Criterion channel, he says our love can destroy this whole fucking world when after they
Gay
they
stuff.
join together. And it did make me wonder, how literal are they being about that? Was this is that just another kind of idea or lens that's kind of thrown into this crazy stew of all these different things that we could look at it through, that there is some sort of an element of like them consummating something
And the fetishes
together
does
through this?
begin as the woman on the subway, I think, and then becomes a man. I don't know.
So there's a repression reading of this too, then possibly, right? That's behind what he envisions happening with the girlfriend, what he ends up doing to the girlfriend, and that can be seen as a repression of who he really is, and his not wanting to confront that fully, and perhaps does at the end. I mean, that's a totally legit other reading, I would say.
Yeah, if they're gonna, throw out a line like that, it certainly invites that kind of possibility, at least. But I do like looking at it through the lens of repression. At the very least, that's something that is kind of being liberated or acknowledged, or just the sense that boundaries are maybe the normal kind of boundaries that they would have considered are being transcended at this point.
And my sense is Seth's, ultimate reading, which, with all great artists is right. This is essentially stream of consciousness. They're creating it, making it, not worrying. The bad art is when they're worrying about the themes first. Those are generally the movies I don't like. So this very much feels like the exact opposite of this. It's just, not vomiting on the screen, but pretty close in incredibly creative ways, and letting us do what we're doing here, try to figure it out for ourselves. That's absolutely what it does feel like, for sure.
Yeah. And it's interesting too that it does end where another movie might begin, with them going out into the world. And there were 2 sequels that the director made to this. I have not seen them. I
Transformers
believe
and Transformers 2.
Right. And I don't think, at least the second one, I don't think directly continues this story, but it might kind of revise it and put it in a slightly different context. I know it's in color, but I don't know. I don't hear as much about the sequels than as this original artifact, and I think that's because it is such a touchstone of its exact time and place in the scene that it came from. And it really stands out in that particular element, as opposed to something as like, we're going to start a great franchise here, and kids are going to have their Iron Man action figures with detachable drill parts or whatever that they can collect. Although I wouldn't mind having one of those. That actually would probably be pretty cool.
Absolutely.
I'm sure someone's made a collectible of some sort you can find online. I'm sure of it.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I imagine the sequels, I mean, from what I've seen like clips and things, and I've read about them, like they look cool, but he got a budget, and became like a real filmmaker at that point, which the amazing thing about this one will always be that it was just him and some people that he drove mad, trying to make this, destroying people's apartments and like making all this himself, which is like the great feat. You can't believe what you're seeing that just somebody did. Just because they felt a crazy idea that they needed to.
It's funny to trace this, the humble origins of this to a little factoid that I discovered while researching this, which was that the director Tsukamoto was cast by Martin Scorsese in Silence, and he actually is I believe a villager that Andrew Garfield meets, who is being tortured for his faith, and I think ends up
Interesting.
being like left in the ocean, like on a pole in the ocean to die or something. It was just really interesting to
Wow.
see that he rose to enough prominence that he was, that Scorsese thought of him to put him in
Yeah.
there, and he was taking this role very seriously, and that this movie and him as an artist has had a real influence and a wide reach.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I want to make sure I give everybody a chance to give any final thoughts we have. We like to end the episodes with each of us saying whether we would unwatch the film if we could, which doesn't necessarily mean you didn't like it, but maybe there was something that you just don't want living in your subconscious for that long. But also, yeah, and then just a chance for any final thoughts, maybe that you had about this. I'll just start off real quick because I don't have a whole lot to say. This was definitely a great first time experience, and I was glad to finally see it and to be able to talk about it in this particular lens and learn about everything that came along with it. I was definitely wrapped up in the whole aesthetic experience of it and enjoyed it a lot more than I thought that I would. And probably the only thing keeping it for me out of the kind of masterpiece status of something like Eraserhead, which I do think is a truly great film, is the kind of sense of exhaustion that sets in at a certain point, which is just kind of part and parcel, I think, of the entire experience. But so it's hard to say, well, maybe I'd trim 6 minutes from this 66-minute movie. So I'm not going to get that particular about it, but I do think that people who maybe are afraid to watch it, you should brace yourself to see some gross things, but also there's a lot more of interest there than just something like that. It's not just like popping on a Saw film or something. It has a lot more on its mind, and so if you are into people like Lynch and Cronenberg, or just experimental or avant-garde filmmaking in general, that this belongs in that kind of a conversation.
I definitely
go
would not
ahead.
want to unwatch this. I maybe would want to unhear that score I mentioned, just because watching a few clips again before we jumped on here, wow, it gets in your head and just keeps clanging around. But no, that's so integral to the movie that I couldn't just separate that. So yeah, as I said, I knew I had to get to this. For years, I've been meaning to get to it, and it is one of those, to your point, Mark, that sometimes movies with reputations like this, you put them on and it's like, oh, it wasn't that intense, or it didn't go that far. This absolutely does. It really goes as far as you imagine, but to a point, for a purpose, and with extreme artistry, I should say. I mean, we didn't really touch on, the practical effects in almost every shot in this movie. And again, that's Shinya Tsukamoto, the director, doing a lot of the effects here too. We did mention the use of stop motion, but just the makeup design, the prosthetics, the props. I mean, the amount of care that goes into every deranged image on the screen. That is the sort of thing that will elevate it above a movie that has a reputation for being transgressive or bizarre or assaultive in a way. And that's all it is. It just feels like that when you finally do get to it. This is one that absolutely lives up to that billing. It's a rough watch. It's a rough sit, but all to a purpose, which makes it worth that watch and worth that sit for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the crafts perspective of this, because if anything, like, maybe this isn't everybody's cup of tea, but like any film student like who's interested in making a film, I think it should watch this, because it is like this guy had limited resources, and look what he was able to achieve with a small crew. Also, maybe it's a lesson in like maybe calm down a little bit, and maybe it's worth it to keep your friends at the end of a movie too, because sounds like he lost all of his friends at the end of this, as which it is feels like an antisocial movie in a way. So
It's true.
But yeah, I adore this movie. It feels like some kind of cyberpunk ritual or something that you're watching. It's so like, as much as it is strange and it's a weird sit, I think it is like, it's always moving. It's so like, it's ADD. If anything, it's just will be like, it's like annoying to the point of just like, okay, all right, I get it. But yeah, there's just nothing quite like it. I'm always very impressed every time I return to it.
All right, so that's 3 not unwatches for Tetsuo the Iron
You
Man.
got it.
We'll watch and be annoyed by again.
Yes. And Josh, before we let you go, I did just want to ask if you could spare a few minutes just with this new book. Are you done writing it at this point, or is it still
I
a work in
am.
progress?
Yeah, the manuscript is in. The publisher has a fairly long lead time, and we wanted to, of course, tie it around Halloween. So we're going to hold off, and it won't be available until next fall at some time. I don't have an exact publication date, but we're looking towards late summer, early fall to tie in with everybody's enthusiasm for horror around Halloween. Of course, horror is big enough. People watch it all year round. But that's sort of the idea. So between now and then, it's just keeping, interest up, the word out, so that people can keep an eye out for it. I'm sure I'll have a few, final edits to make and things like that between now and then. But most of the work is done at this point.
All right. Well, as soon as there is a release date, then we will definitely mention that again to our listeners. And if I could just pick your brain just real quick, is something that you did take away from the whole experience of that, or maybe something that surprised you coming
Boy,
in or
that is a
going out?
really good question. I think what I came away with is just more of an appreciation for the genre, and which would seem obvious, spending that much time with it, but also just its depth and its relevance to our everyday lives and our everyday experiences. I feel like horror can be written off as something that is in its own corner, doesn't have a lot of significance. And I kind of needed to test that by doing this on 2 levels. What is the artistic significance, a critical appraisal of these sorts of films, and then also what sort of theological significance can be taken from them, especially as I think Seth, you said, horror can be summarily dismissed by faith audiences. And so that was part of the challenge too, is to see what sort of religious resonance can be found in this genre. And I think I found a lot. So that was just rewarding to have that sort of verified, and just affirm that all these years watching horror films, I wasn't completely wasting my time.
Well, that's a good discovery. That would be terrible if you discovered it was all just a waste of time at the end of this project.
Wouldn't it? Yeah. Kind of disappointing.
Yeah, but
we would want to know.
Yeah, but it sounds like it's a fascinating perspective, and whether it's a secular reader or not, it seemed like that's an absolutely like fascinating and fruitful way to approach these films. So I could see anybody being interested in that.
Yeah, that's the plan. I mean, it's, written from a particular perspective for a particular reader. But I found with Movies Are Prayers that, general readers were intrigued as well. And I think that's what good criticism does. I mean, you have books of feminist film criticism, books looking at films through a class lens. So it's really just another lens. And I've always appreciated looking at film, reading about film through a lens different than my own. So yeah, the hope is that this will have a broad appeal as well. So if it does sound interesting, again, between now and publication, I've been sending out emails to folks, just letting them know about the process, some excerpts, some sneak previews, things like that. So that's fuller.edu/fear not if anybody wants to sign up to get those.
And we will link to that in the episode description as well.
Well, we really appreciate having you on, Josh. I think it was exciting to have us talk about this like crazy weird movie, and it's kind of great, like, to have what's the weirdest thing we could do is actually to have maybe a Christian come on and talk about this bizarre, really gross Japanese movie. Like, I kind of love that.
Happy for the chance. Thanks for the invite. It was fun to do.
Absolutely.
Unwatchables is produced by Tony Scarpitti, hosted by me, Marc Dottavio, and Seth Troyer, with artwork by Micah Kraus. You can find Seth and I on Letterboxd under Marc Dottavio and Sloth Troyer. You can also check us out at unwatchablespod.com for links to our Twitter and Instagram, or support us on Patreon for bonus content and to have a say in what we watch. Thanks for listening.